Welcome to you all this sunny Tuesday morning. This is day 2 of our University of Bristol Turing University Fellows presentations. My name is Professor Kate Robson-Brown. I'm Director of the University of Bristol's Jean Golding Institute for Data Science, and it's a real pleasure to be able to chair these events during the week. These events are a celebration of the research which has been undertaken by Bristol University Turing University Fellows funded by the Turing. This was a call in 2018 for new fellows and projects associated with those fellowships, and all the work that you're seeing across the week, including today, has been supported by the Turing University Partnership. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you could take a moment to read the JGI Code of Conduct for events, for online events, which we put in the chat, that would be great. This session will be recorded, so you may want to turn your video feed off for the duration. If you're interested in other events that the Turing runs like this, please do take a look at the website, and our coordinator Lily is just going to pop that in the chat for you as well. We will be using Slido for Q&A. We found this is the easiest way to kind of corral lots of questions coming in from the audience for events like this. So again, Lily's just about to put the link in the chat. If you could use that to write your questions, and then at the end of each presentation, I will pipe up and read them as part of the Q&A session. So we have 3 talks this morning: Professor Peter Flach, Dr. Song Liu, and Patrick Rubin Delanchy, and we're going to start off with Professor Peter Flach talking about Towards a Measurement Theory for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Kate. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I hope this is all visible for everybody. It's not meant to be in landscape, so if it's in portrait, that's all okay. This is actually an in-browser presentation done with reveal.js. There's a link there to the online version, there are many links in the slides. So this is something that you may want to look afterwards. Okay, so let's get going. So this is about measurement theory. So why should a data scientist or an AI person or a machine learner care about measurement? We don't hear a lot about this. Well, actually, measurements are everywhere in machine learning. So features are measurements, right? So you measure the height of a person or age or whatever it is. And so it probably is a good idea to think a little bit about the scale of those features, because the scale then dictates things like admissible statistics and operations that you can do on the feature. For example, taking an expectation assumes a linear scale. And so if your feature is not expressed on a linear scale, then maybe you should transform it before you take the expectation. But more importantly for this talk, performance metrics, accuracy, F-score, precision recall, they're also measurements. And so again, we need to understand the scale on which they are expressed before we can, for example, average them. And so in this project, I've looked at foundational issues in measurement applied to data science and AI. And perhaps surprisingly, there are many foundational issues, and there are many open questions. So, so let's start with the easy bit. So performance measurement is easy in some cases. So here's an example, thought experiment. If I split the data set in 2 or more parts, maybe 10 parts in cross-validation, you could ask the question, is it classified as accuracy on the entire data set, so the union of all 10, is it equal to the average of the accuracies on the separate parts? And to be precise and to practice what I preach, when I say average, I need to be precise. What average do I mean? And here I mean the arithmetic mean. Okay, I've given you a second to think about that. And the answer is yes, provided the parts are of equal size, which is what we typically do in cross-validation. Otherwise, you would need to use a weighted arithmetic mean. Okay, so what about per class recall? So true positive rate, true negative rate. Again, the answer is yes, provided the parts have the same class distribution, which is what you do in stratified cross-validation, for example. Okay, so this is the easy bit. But now, and this is a question that is been bugging me for a long time. What about precision? Is a classifies precision on the entire data set equal to the average of the precisions on the parts, where precision is the proportion of predictions of a particular class that are correct? And the answer to this is no. It is in general not, so the precision on the entire data set is not equal to the arithmetic mean of the precision on the parts, unless the classifier's predictions are equally distributed on each part. So on each part, the classifier makes 10% class A, 20% class B, and so on, which is A, very unlikely, and B, not under the experimenter's control. The class distribution is under my control because that's a property of the data set, but the predicted distribution is not under my control. And hence, the same applies to F-score, which is an aggregate of recall and precision. So in earlier work that kind of led to this Turing project, we looked at this, and we had actually a paper at what was then called NIPS, now NeurIPS, in 2015, where we looked at how does this affect the common practice of precision recall curves. And we found that it affects that considerably, and that there's actually a better way to do precision recall curves. And I'll go very briefly through how we got there, because that's actually insightful, because it involves a change of scale. And so how we fixed it was, on the left, you have the standard definition of precision and recall. Precision is true positive divided by true positive plus false positive. Recall, similar definition with the false negative. We take the reciprocals of each of these. So now we're mapping a number in the 0-1 interval to a number in the 1 to infinity interval. Then we clip the top end of the interval, because if you're close to infinity, it means that your precision and or your recall is very small, and we are, for good reasons, are not interested in that bit of the scale. And then we renormalize, we map it back into the unit interval. So these are all change of scale operations. And once you've done that, then interestingly, precision recall curves become very similar to ROC curves. So I can do linear interpolation, I can take the convex hull, the area under the precision recall gain curve, as we call it, is meaningful because it's proportional to an expected F1 score, in a similar way as the area under the ROC curve is equal to an expected accuracy. And we can even use that curve for calibration in the same way as we could use a ROC convex hull for calibration. So just as an early example, I can't claim this as an output of my Turing project, but it was an early motivation for this. Okay, so here's what I will talk about today. So I will give a kind of a bird's eye view over scales, units, dimensions, and types, and provide perspectives that were provided not by me, but by other people from psychology, physics, and computer science. And sort of this will indicate perhaps a way forward. This bit of the talk is quite preliminary, but it indicates a way forward, how we could maybe build on this in data science and AI. And the other thing that I want to point out is actually very often what you're interested in is not what you can observe. So for example, and cognitive scientists know this. So when they want to test students on their ability, the outcome of the test, of the exam, is observable, but that's just a proxy for actually a latent ability, and it's the latent ability that we want. So I will talk a little bit about how we took inspiration from cognitive science to apply that to measurement, performance measurement in machine learning. Okay, scales, units, dimensions, and types. There doesn't exist, to my knowledge, a definitive framework to link all these concepts together, but there are bits and pieces. That's kind of have interesting properties, but also leave some things to be desired. So perhaps a well-known one is Stevens' levels of measurement, developed in the Second World War and published in Science just thereafter. So Stevens came up with this typology of 4 scale types, which are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, each of which have kind of, sort of, they accrue additional properties when you go further down this list. So nominal and ordinal are pretty obvious. An interval scale is a scale where you can compare differences, but not ratios. So for example, temperature in Celsius or Fahrenheit are interval scales because the 0 is kind of chosen arbitrarily in some sense. And a ratio scale would be, for temperature, would be Kelvin, where we actually have a fixed 0. So only in Kelvin is it meaningful to say that one body is twice as hot as the other body. Okay, and then, and then we have admissible statistics. So we can apply the mode to nominal scales. In addition, we can apply things like the median to ordinal scales. We can apply the arithmetic mean to interval scales and so on. So each scale type inherits everything that comes above. So that's kind of, this was basically the state of play in 1946, and it kind of became gospel pretty soon after, but there was very little development further down. And also, it is viewed by many people, including statisticians, as something quite rigid. So is it really so rigid that you need to have exactly that scale type to apply particular statistics? So, there are discussions about Spearman's rank correlation statistics, which Stevens would say is not admissible for ordinal data, which is counterintuitive. But more importantly, there are many scales that do not fit one of those 4 types. And very importantly, probability is one of them, because probability doesn't only have a fixed 0, it also has a fixed 1. And Stevens didn't say anything about that. Counts are another one that doesn't really fit very well. There have been proposals to develop this. Tukey looked at this together with Mosteller. Chrisman looked at it from, I think, a geology point of view. But yeah, there are many open questions still here. Okay, moving on to physics. Physics has this very interesting concept of a dimension. And this dates back to at least to Joseph Fourier, two centuries ago, pretty much to the day. So the idea in physics is that feet or meters are a unit, and they are different units, but they share a dimension, length. Okay, and so in order to add or subtract physical quantities, they need to have the same dimension. Of course, also they need to have the same unit, but the point is that physical laws don't depend on the unit, but they do depend on the dimension. And in fact, there is theory like Buckingham's pi theorem that actually allows you to sometimes derive the form of the physical law just from knowing the dimensions of the quantities involved. And then if you have incommensurable quantities, which you can't add or subtract, but you can multiply and divide them, and that actually gives you new derived dimensions. So for example, pressure is force divided by area. Force is mass times acceleration. So from that, you can derive that pressure has the dimension mass divided by length divided by time squared. And then you can attach units to that. So for the SI units would be Pascal is Newton per square meters is kilogram per, well, that expression there. Okay, that's the good part of the story in physics, but there are also problems here. So for example, dimensions can cancel. So angle is a ratio of lengths, and therefore angle is dimensionless, although it still has units, because radians and degrees are different units for angles. And some people have actually argued that angle, so you have basically length in two different directions, and maybe the length in direction y should be a different dimension than length in direction x. So then you get a dimension back into this ratio. And even sometimes units cancel. Alcohol by volume, it has the unit milliliter ethanol per 100 milliliter liquid, which is a percentage. Okay, and then going further, if you go beyond addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and you have, for example, logarithms, you can't coherently assign a dimension to things like logarithms. So logarithm of length is not a valid dimension. You first need to make the length or the volume dimensionless, and then you can take the logarithm, which kind of in machine learning is a bit strange, because we are very used to this idea that bits are kind of logarithm of probabilities. And sort of we would like to say that bit is a kind of dimension which is obtained from the probabilities by a logarithmic operation. So my conclusion so far would be that both these perspectives are a bit restricted. They have interesting features, and they appear to be overly focused on establishing a true scale or a type or a dimension for a measurement. Machine learning, data science, AI need something more flexible. And moreover, we need a better treatment of dimensionless quantities, which are, of course, everywhere in statistics and machine learning. And you know, probabilities, counts, relative frequencies, absolute frequencies, all these things could do with some kind of more meaningful treatment of dimensions. So I will, in a moment, I will give as an example Shannon entropy, where I would say Shannon entropy can be interpreted from an information theory perspective, but also from a proper scoring rule perspective. And actually, I would argue that this would lead to kind of a different view of the dimension, essentially, of the entropy term. So here is, I think, and this is very early work. This is where computer science perspective can provide value, because in computer science we have this concept of an abstract data type. And an abstract data type is basically it binds together a type with admissible operations on the type. And I don't have time to go through this, but there's actually, this is linked to in the slides to an environment here where you can try these things out. If this loads, oh, there we go. So this is actually one of my favorite languages, Haskell. And oops, there we are. Loading it, it's very slow. And then we can, so basically here we say that we can talk about a fair die. See if this works. Oh, it doesn't work. Okay, a fair die is a distribution, and also we can have a loaded die. Oh, that doesn't work well. Oh, I see. Loaded die. Here we go. It's a different distribution, which doesn't show here. This teaches me a very old lesson that I should never run code in a presentation. So I'm going to leave it there, but this is something that you can play with. So the point here, and this is a highly speculative point, is that I think computer science abstract data types has something to offer here that would be really useful in machine learning to provide the kind of formal type theory and semantics for these kind of questions that I've been addressing here. Okay, finally, in the few minutes that I have left, I will briefly talk about something that we did actually do a fair bit of work in, which is build on the idea that the things that we're interested in are not directly observable. And psychologists have developed things like item response theory for that. And here is what item response theory looks like from a machine learning perspective. Don't worry if I don't have the time to go through all of this, but the basic idea is very simple. There are participants and items. Items are kind of questions or exams or data sets or instances. A participant has an ability. An item has a difficulty. And basically, the performance of the participant on the item depends crucially on the difference between the ability and the difficulty. So if the ability is higher than the difficulty, then the participant will perform well. And if the ability is lower than the difficulty, then the participant will perform poorly. And basically, then you make some assumptions how these things are distributed. That gives you a familiar logistic curve, and that's what people in IRT have used. We have changed this a little bit using beta distribution, which has several advantages. One advantage is that now our abilities and difficulties are measured in the interval 0, 1, whereas in IRT they're measured on the whole real line. We make some other changes. The details are not very important. And then we have these what is known as item characteristic curves. So that tells me how quickly, for example, performance drops off if the ability is lower, or performance increases if the ability is higher. And so there is a parameter here, A, which is discrimination, which basically tells us in the midpoint how steep this curve goes. And interestingly, discrimination can be negative. And if you have negative discrimination, psychologists don't like this, but I think that's actually a useful concept. If you have negative discrimination, you basically have questions where the participants with higher ability perform poor on. So it's kind of, maybe very subtle things where higher ability participants overthink it, whereas the lower ability participant doesn't even see that it's a kind of a trick question. And we've used this idea in a machine learning context where we essentially use it to identify noisy examples. So the hypothesis here is that noisy examples, and you don't see the full picture here, but basically there are two Gaussian clouds here. And then the green points, we deliberately flip the class of those noisy points, and then we try to recover that. And with the concept of negative discrimination, we could actually identify those points. The hypothesis is that the high ability classifiers, if they misclassify those points, that gives us evidence that these are actually noisy points. So we had some success there. And the key point here is that an item is an instance. Okay, so we identify easy instances, hard instances, and we also identify the ability of classifiers, and so that we can compare them with each other. The second idea is actually moves on to having not data points as items, but whole data sets as items. And we try to do the following thing, which again is quite common in item response theory, which is the idea of adaptive testing. So instead of giving a student 100 questions, you're basically searching for their ability. And so you give them maybe a moderately hard question, and depending on whether they get that question right or wrong, you either give them a harder question or you give them an easier question. And so in that way, with just a handful of questions, you can zoom into, you can quite precisely see what their ability is. And so we applied this idea in machine learning. So the idea is you start with an initial guess of your classifier ability, you choose the next data set which would be most useful to test that ability. Then you evaluate the classifier, you update your ability estimation, and you repeat until some stopping criterion is achieved. And I'll just show you one slide here. With this kind of method, with only a handful of tests, you can already get very close to the estimate that you would have got if you ran all, whatever it is, 176 tests or whatever, no, a little bit less, 160 tests. So this is relevant for kind of benchmarking in machine learning, because it would be it would be good to have a benchmarked test suite where we only run a few tests. Today we run many tests because we want to have the statistical power, but this is a method where we can save a lot of effort and still get a good result. And I see that Kate is appearing here, so I will wrap up very soon. And I want to finish with another speculative point that we actually haven't done anything about, but I want to leave you with this thought. Empirical machine learning data science needs to make causal statements. We don't just want to know that algorithm A outperformed algorithm B. We want to know why. We want a reason. So here's a possible reason. Algorithm A outperformed algorithm B because the classes were highly imbalanced. Counterfactually, this means if I had rebalanced the classes, that difference in performance would disappear. And that's a causal statement. And interestingly, causal inference is hard because in real life, we can't do these interventions. We can't first give the patient a particular drug and then take the drug away and see what happens. But in machine learning, of course, we can. We can rebalance the classes. There's no memory. The classifier doesn't remember that it has seen this data set before. And we can actually do interventions. So causal analysis would be a whole lot easier here. So my conclusions, I've been looking at measurement theory. I think there's a lot of interesting work still to do there. We need to develop this idea of coherent types and metadata for the observables. We need a proper model for the unobservables and how they relate to each other. And eventually, we actually need causal models because we need to go beyond correlation and see causation there. So part of this work was funded through the Turing project, so there is a link there, and sort of there is quite a lot of material there. There are some papers there. There's quite a lot of videos there, which I would encourage you to look at. And finally, how Song did a lot of this work, who was the postdoc on the project, and I have many brilliant collaborators, which I hope to collaborate more with in future. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take questions.
Fantastic, thanks, Peter. I think we could probably just squeeze in a couple of questions. That's okay. So the first one is from Alex. Have you also considered how construct validation and measurement could be applied to machine learning predictions?
How construct validation and measurement could be applied to machine learning predictions? The short answer is no, but I would like to understand the questions a little bit more. But I think I know which Alex this is, so I'm happy to take that offline, Alex. Nice of you to come by. Sorry, I don't have any immediate insights.
That's fine. Let's move on though. So a question from Oliver. What are your views on jointly transformation projection of multi or high dimensional measures, some at intervals and some ratios?
Okay.
You can have a look on Slido if you click through.
Yeah, I don't have this open at the moment, so
okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have any. My brain, I have a senior moment.
It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. We'll go for one more, and then we're gonna move on.
Okay.
Does recent systematic reviews find statistically significant findings for causal ML analysis using developed countries' data? I'm not absolutely sure I follow that question, actually, having read it through.
I'm not sure if there's a question in that question, but maybe it's something worth looking at.
Does recent systematic reviews find statistically significant findings for causal ML analysis using developed countries' data? Let's take these offline.
Yes, I'd be very happy. Sorry, I'm not doing very well.
It's fine. No, there's one from Kieran in the audience who was also with us yesterday, asking where he can, another reminder of where he can find your material online, Peter?
Yes, so the best thing to do would be to go to, I'll post this in, I'm not sure if I can post it in the chat. Let me just see. So this is the whole presentation on, and I'll stop sharing now. This is the whole presentation on GitHub. And so there are many links in the presentation that you can just follow, including links to the Turing webpage. And so all the stuff is there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I can't give you an actual round of applause, but virtual round of applause. Thanks very much, Peter. Really fascinating as always.
Thank you.
Right, now let's move on to Song. Song is going to give us a talk on statistical inferences of intractable models using density ratio estimation. Over to you, Song.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Great, great. One second. Can you see my screen, the full screen slides?
Yes.
Great, great. Okay. So thank you very much for coming today. Also, I think I didn't really time my talk very well. I think I included too many slides, but I'll try to explain as much as I can. First, I just want to give you a quick overview of this intractable model inference problem. So the title of this talk is Intractable Model Inference. So I basically ignored density ratio estimation because I felt that might be a little bit too technical. But I just want to, in general, kind of talk about this intractable model inference problem and also some new perspective I've gained in the last few years while working on this problem. Okay, so a quick intro of these model fitting of this intractable model fitting problem. So just one second, let me move the Zoom bar to a different place so I can easily see the slides. Okay, so let's look at this very classic problem that is, model fitting in statistical inference, given a data set X, and I would like to fit a statistical model P of X parameterized by theta, and my probabilistic model P of X is defined in this way as an unnormalized density function divided by a normalizing constant Z of theta, okay? And this Z of theta is just simply an integral of my unnormalized density function so that I can ensure that the density function itself is integrated to 1 over its domain X, okay? And to fit such a model parameter, usually we apply something like maximum likelihood estimation, MLE. And basically, I just maximize the log density function that is evaluated over all of my data points, xi. And then I obtain an estimate of my model parameter, theta hat. All right. So this looks very simple in theory. But we have this complexity issue of our model in recent years applications, because the P bar, the unnormalized part of my density model, might be very sophisticated. For example, my input X might be in a very high dimensional space, and in some applications like biology, gene network expression data set, and X might represent activity levels of a massive gene network. And then the dimensionality of X might be a few thousands or tens of thousands. And also this P bar itself, this unnormalized density itself might be very complex. For example, in image processing applications, we might have to use a pre-trained deep neural network as P bar. And the complexity of P bar leads to a big problem. And that is the normalizing constant. And this normalizing constant, as I mentioned, is an integral with respect to the unnormalized part of my density model. And evaluating this d theta requires us to compute this integral, which is very computationally demanding in previous cases. And in fact, even approximating this v theta, the normalizing term, is highly non-trivial. And to make the computation even trickier, this integration sometimes is computed over an irregular domain. So usually we would think, okay, this integral is calculated with respect to the entire real domain or something like that. But in some special cases, this domain might be very irregular, as we will see an example later, okay? And this intractability of my normalizing term z theta leads to the intractability of maximum likelihood estimation. In other words, if the normalizing constant is intractable, then maximum likelihood estimation is not applicable. But apparently here I'm giving you this talk to give you some hopes, apparently. So there are two different approaches, and that is also used in my recent research in dealing with these intractable models. So the first one is solving a different inference problem, because in many cases in machine learning applications, solving model fitting problem is very hard, but it's not necessary. For example, in classification tasks, we only want a classifier that separates two sets of data, and that's it. And we don't want to fit a hard, we just don't want to fit a model on this entire data set or individual sets of data in different classes. Okay, so just solve a different problem. And the second approach of tackling this issue is developing novel model fitting methodologies. And this, I will give you a few examples later. First one is to use some computational tricks on existing model fitting criteria. And the second one is finding new and novel ways or novel model fitting criteria that does not need the evaluation of my normalizing constant d theta. Okay, so our following talk will introduce our recent works on intractable model inference following these two different directions. Okay, so the first research I want to talk about is learning changes in models in high-dimensional graphical models. And this, perhaps I need to talk about the application at first. So the application itself is a kind of change detection problem, but it is a change detection in terms of the graphical models of my random variables. So the biology application behind is that I have two data sets here, as you can see, as color-coded matrices. Okay, so these two color-coded matrices are data that is represent activity levels of different genes. So basically, I have activity levels of genes in the massive gene network. And these genes are all related to each other, are all kind of regulating or activating or deactivate each other. So what I want to detect is the change of the behavior of those genes, how they would regulate each other in two different scenarios, okay? So for example, some genes might be active in the morning and some other, okay. So basically, what I want to do is to discover the change of the underlying graphical model from distribution P to distribution Q. And in this specific case, the dimensionality of my data set is extremely high. So let's have a look at the parameterization of the graphical model. So the simplest kind of graphical model is parameterized as a pairwise graphical model, and it has a density function looks like this. So you can see this density function looks very similar to the density function I explained earlier that has a normalizing constant z and also has an unnormalized part. And here the unnormalized part is an exponential function and is factorized over all different pairs of my random variables. So you can see this graphical model encodes the interactions of pairs of random variables. And the simplest graphical model is Gaussian graphical model. So here the feature function f is simply just xu times xv. But as I mentioned, in this specific application, the dimensionality is large, and therefore the density function is intractable as normalizing constant z theta is very computationally demanding because you are solving this integral in a very high dimensional space. However, we are only interested in the change of graphical model or the change of interaction represented by my graphical model. Therefore, we don't really have to solve the hard problem of fitting individual density functions. So we only have to look at the ratio of density functions. And here is a quick look at the ratio of these two graphical models. So I have a probabilistic model P, and I have probabilistic model Q. And then once I take the ratio, you can see these become the ratio of two exponential functions. And then this ratio of exponential functions can be rewritten as the single exponential function parameterized by the difference between theta P and theta Q. And you can see here, the difference between these two parameters exactly represents what has been changed between these two graphical models, right? And therefore, this is what I said, that in order to understand the change of graphical model, we only need to look at the ratio between two density functions. And therefore, we just model this ratio function directly by letting the difference to be a single parameter, delta. And then we can establish a ratio model like this, which is again an exponential function and multiplying a normalizing constant n hat. And here the n hat again is a normalizing term of the density ratio function. And you can see this has a tractable form and just simply the sum over all my data points from distribution Q. And this is to ensure that the ratio function multiplies Q of X is integrated over its domain equals to 1. And you can easily understand why, because if you have a ratio P divided by Q, and then multiplying Q should become a density function, and then integrating that density function should give you exactly 1. Okay, and here by using this new density ratio parameterization, we can again estimate this ratio parameter delta by maximizing the likelihood, log likelihood ratio. And because of this parameterization, we avoided solving the intractable maximum likelihood problem for individual density Px and Qx. And in this specific research, I also want my changes to be rare, okay? And so I use sparse model inference techniques, like introducing regularization terms. But this regularizer would again introduce estimation bias. So this is one of the follow-up work that we have done in recent years that is using the inverse of Hessian to essentially debias the estimated parameter. And then the estimated parameter will have a normal distribution that is very easy to do significant tests and so on and so forth. Okay, so here is an example how I apply this technique to an actual gene expression change detection problem. So I have collected two different data sets, and these are gene activities under two different stimuli, EGF and HRG. And then I compare these two gene networks by using the density ratio density ratio technique I explained earlier. And you can see this is the change between two graphs, two graphical models. And you can see this change graph all centered around a gene called FOSB, F-O-S-B. And this FOSB is actually a known regulator of cell proliferation and differentiation. Therefore, it makes sense that this kind of dominate the change between two graphical models. And basically, this kind of is a switch in my gene network. It is on, then the activities of other genes are also influenced. And then it is off, then other gene activities are also kind of switched off. So that's kind of a regulator of my gene expression. So our method gives a result that makes biological sense. Okay, so the second topic I want to talk about fitting intractable model directly. So how do we solve this, intractable model fitting problem directly, rather than, finding a different problem to solve? So in the earlier approach, I found a different problem to solve in this specific application. But in some cases, I just want to solve this intractable model fitting problem. And how should we do that? So if we look back at maximum likelihood, and we can see maximum likelihood actually minimizes a Kullback-Leibler divergence, and the Kullback-Leibler divergence is like this. And then, after some, algebraic manipulations and sample approximations, eventually we got this estimation criterion. And this is essentially the maximum likelihood estimation. It comes from Kuebeck-Leibler divergence minimization. And we love maximum likelihood solution because it has many, many good asymptotic properties. Okay. But you might wonder, if we want to solve model fitting problem for intractable models, why don't we just, like maximum likelihood, directly minimize this Kuebeck-Leibler divergence, right? From our data distribution Qx to model distribution P of X, okay? The problem again here comes from the intractability of my model density P of X, because this cannot be evaluated because of that normalizing constant. So then in recent years, in machine learning literatures, people started to look for alternative or surrogates of Kuebeck-Leibler divergence from P theta to Q. Okay, so here I just want to talk about one specific approach. That is, can we find a surrogate that mimics the behavior of Kuebeck-Leibler divergence? I don't want to find something completely different. I just want to find something that mimics the behavior of Kuebeck-Leibler divergence. All right. So then the question becomes, can we estimate the ratio between our data density Q of X and model density P of theta? Right. So here, as you can see, the Kuebeck-Leibler divergence is an expectation of log ratio Q divided by P. If I can approximate this ratio accurately, then I can approximate this Kuebeck-Leibler divergence accurately. So the question becomes, can we estimate this ratio? As we already seen earlier, in some situation, estimating the ratio is a lot easier than estimating the individual density functions. And here, one thing we need to notice is our density ratio model need to satisfy this condition, that is integration with respect to P theta equals to 1. So again, like what I explained before, this integration is to ensure that multiplication between this, which is a ratio multiplies its denominator, which becomes the numerator, is integrated to 1. It's a proper density. Okay, so that's a kind of one condition we need to satisfy. So here, I want to quickly explain something called Stein features. So basically, you can think Stein feature is a kind of feature function like any other feature functions you use in a machine learning, but with a slight different twist. So imagine you have this feature function f, like a polynomial feature, and then imagine T theta is a mapping. It is a mapping that is constructed in this way on each individual dimension of my feature function f. And then this transform is simply an inner product between a nabla x of P theta times this nabla x fi. So it involves the evaluation of my density model. However, one thing to notice is that this gradient nabla x of log theta does not include our normalizing constant, because normalizing constant is just a constant. When you take derivative, it is gone. So calculating this feature does not involve evaluating this intractable z normalizing constant. All right. Okay, so here I just give you a few visualizations of my Stein feature, and just to convince you, that these features are just the regular features, are not kind of something, crazy. All right. And, according to something called Stein equality, under mild regularity conditions, the expectation with respect to my Stein feature equals to exactly 0. So this holds under many very mild regularity conditions. And in the end, so this inspires us to model our density ratio function using these so-called Stein features. So the model is very simple, just a linear model, a parameter multiplies this Stein feature plus 1. And you can see what happens when I try to normalize our density ratio model. And this is simply becomes an expectation of my ratio model. And then this ratio model is just a linear combination between my parameter and Stein feature plus 1. And then it becomes something like this. And because of Stein equality, this equals to 0. Therefore, this entire thing equals to just 0. Okay, therefore, our normalizing condition of my density ratio model is satisfied. And so we can have a Stein density ratio estimator, just we did before, that maximizing the log likelihood ratio of my ratio model, R of X. And then this gives me an estimate of my ratio parameter delta hat. Okay, so here, using this delta hat, we can obtain an estimate of my ratio function, that is Q divided by P theta. And ideally, maximum likelihood solves, fits a parameter theta using a data set XQ such that the Kuebeck-Leibler divergence is minimized. So this is something we've already talked about. But now, since we have a ratio approximation of Q divided by P theta, then we can approximate this Kuebeck-Leibler divergence by using our estimated ratio function, log ratio function, and then it becomes something like this, okay? And eventually we will have this, then we can just minimize this approximated Kuebeck-Leibler divergence to obtain a parameter estimate theta. So this is explained in this criterion, basically just a minimax problem and minimizing this approximated Kuebeck-Leibler divergence with respect to my parameter theta. So that's my kind of alternative to maximum likelihood on intractable models. Again, minimizing Kuebeck-Leibler divergence, but with a small twist that I need to estimate the ratio between Q and P theta. Okay, so I call this DLE, discriminative likelihood estimation. So I just want to quickly show you one experiment as my time is, I think, running out. So basically, I created a density model, which is, P bar of X, and it is exponential function of theta transpose phi of X, where phi of X is a pre-trained deep neural network. So apparently you can see our density function here, P, is not tractable because we have a complicated unnormalized density function. But again, we can use our DLE, discriminative likelihood estimation, I just explained earlier, to fit this intractable model. And here I plot two different lines of my fitted results. Okay, sorry. So I fit this deep neural network model, I fit this unnormalized density model on MNIST data set, which is a data set contains lots of digits, right? And then here I just plot two lines of digits that has the highest fitted likelihood and lowest fitted likelihood. On the top row, it is the highest fitted likelihood digits. And on the bottom row, it is the lowest likelihood digits. And you can see on the top row, these digits all look very sort of regular, right? Because, they are kind of very typical examples of, handwritten digits. And on the bottom row, you can see those digits are highly irregular. It's not, it does not look like human handwritten digits. And you can see that our procedure does, give high likelihood to those normal looking digits and give low likelihood to those irregular looking digits. So that's kind of validation that our model fitting method works. Okay, I'm afraid that I don't have time to talk about the third topic, which is, learning intractable model on truncated data set. So I'll just skip that. And later, I think we can share the slides. And again, we can have whatever communication after the talk. So in conclusion, in the last few years, I've been working on this intractable model fitting problem. And those are models that do not have a tractable normalization term. And in two different ways, we can actually bypass the issue of the intractability. So the first case, we solved a different problem because the application we want to solve does not require us to fit a likelihood function using maximum likelihood. So we just solved a different problem instead. and that is tractable. And in the second case we talked about, we simply mimic the maximum likelihood solution using a computational trick called Stein density estimation to approximate that intractable Kuebec-Leibler divergence. Then I can do something similar to maximum likelihood estimation and minimizing that Kuebec-Leibler divergence. And I don't have time to talk about the third application, but it is about truncated density estimation. Here, I used a different technique called score matching. So instead of using Kuebec-Leibler divergence as the difference measure between model density and my data density, I used a different divergence called Fisher divergence. And then I minimize that divergence to obtain a model parameter. Okay, so that's all about my talk that ambitiously covers 3 different topics. And if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Song Liu. Really fascinating. I let your talk run a bit because of the interruption, but we do have time for a question, I think, if that's okay. So we've got a question from Oliver. What are your views on, first of all, regularizing the original model directly, and secondly, bringing the original dimensionality of X down by, say, projection?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, well, so by regularizing the original model or original data set, I feel you can still get like information from the original structure of your data. So that's actually what we want, because the original data comes from a network. So we want to know how the network has changed between these 2 different scenarios. And if you do a kind of projection, you do get a lower dimensional representation of your data set. But then this kind of network structure is lost, is not preserved. So I think it depends on the application, what is the target of your application. And then you might want to use regularizing the original model directly, or bring down the dimensionality by using sort of dimensionality reduction methods. Depends on what you need.
Great, thank you. And then just to finish off, just a very quick query from Richard. Have you released implementations of any of the presented methods so that the audience can try them on their own?
Yes. Actually, all of those methods are on GitHub. So you can find my GitHub on
Can you put the link
homepage.
in the? Yeah, can you put the link in the chat for us?
Yes, I will. I will after the
great.
Yeah, I will type in the chat. Type in the chats.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Song. There's lots of love in the room in the chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so our third talk of the morning, we're moving over to Dr. Patrick Rubin Delanchy, who's going to be speaking on analysis of jointly embedded cybersecurity graphs. Over to you, Patrick. You're on mute.
Hello, everyone. Let me try to share my screen. Can you all hear me? All good? All right.
Yeah, it's fine.
So thanks, Kate, and everybody at the JGI for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really excited to give it. Before I start with the content, let me just quickly acknowledge contributions from Andy Jones, Ian Gallagher, Annie Gray, Ed Davis, and Nick Whiteley, who are all researchers in different capacities at the University of Bristol. So I'll give a special mention, I think, to Andy Jones, because he was a postdoc that I was able to hire on this Turing Fellowship. And actually, Andy has very recently been awarded his own fellowship. So that's one of the very happy outcomes of this project. And I'll just acknowledge the others as I go along. So this was a Turing Fellowship with project, and it sort of had a number of different sorts of funded support, so sources of research support. But I suppose the most significant of those were 20% buyout. So I was sort of given 20% of my time to do research on this project. and also this postdoc Andy Jones, and that was for 2 years. So I know the audience is very diverse, so some surprisingly so, given the last talk, and so I thought it would be helpful to start by just giving you a flavor of the nature of a research, even before talking about its content. So this, of course, because the Turing Fellowship was a project in the area of data science and AI, you'd say it was machine learning. You might even more accurately call it statistics. I'm not saying these terms are exchangeable, but you could validly describe the project as any of these things. But I suppose it's kind of important to understand that it's methodological research, right? So the focus here is on creating rather than applying methods of data analysis. And of course, as you can tell from the title of my talk, which is also the title of my Turing project, the data we're thinking about here take the form of one or more large graphs, right? And the word graph is just a mathematical term to describe network. So as I go along, I'll just use the word graph and network completely interchangeably. And what we're trying to do really is simply enable exploratory data analysis, right? Which was a phrase coined by John Tukey in 1977. Tukey actually came up in an earlier talk. And he simply described it as looking at data to see what it seems to say. So in a way, our remit is simple and unambitious, right? We have these large, complex graphs, and we just want to discover things about them. So the word in the title that might have been most unfamiliar to you was this word embedding, right? And so I have one dedicated slide just to explain to you what graph embedding is. And it's the science or the art, perhaps, of taking a graph or a network, such as the one you see on the left here. So I've drawn one here on 6 nodes, but of course we're thinking about much larger networks in practice. And trying to represent each of the nodes of the graph, so each of these circles here, as a point in some high dimensional space. Right? Now, why do we want to do that? Well, for very many reasons, and I'll give you a few in a second. But broadly speaking, if you're trying to do statistics, or if you're trying to do machine learning, the tools you have available want to have data that look like that, and not data that look like a network. Right? You want feature vectors to give to your machine learning algorithms, not networks. So I'll give you a few sort of slightly more concrete applications, and I'll start, of course, with cybersecurity, which was the main application funding this Turing Fellowship. Whether you're trying to uncover malicious activity on the dark web, or whether you're trying to find intruders in a corporate network, or perhaps you're looking to detect cyber attacks at a very large global scale, you'll tend to extract different sorts of networks and use embedding to then analyze these embeddings for anomalies. Right, so that's what I've tried to indicate here with this diagram. I've also become more recently interested in security more widely defined, including things like anti-human trafficking and anti-corruption. So here you encounter these very large, complex networks. In the case of human trafficking, for example, it could be potential victims and potential human traffickers. It could be websites. It could be pictures. It could be phone numbers, and all of these things linked together, even on a soft or hard way. And a typical task that a law enforcement officer might sort of face is to somehow try to locate a victim, right? And if you abstract a little bit away from the specifics of a problem, you tend to often find that you're using graph embeddings to determine whether 2 points are suspiciously close somehow. But if you're interested in security, if you're interested in another aspect of science like cell biology or genetics or whatever, basically graphs, networks, similarity matrices, these things occur basically in every walk of science, right? And the general problem is, given this very large network or matrix, try to discover underlying structure and geometry. Okay. So this fellowship sort of promised that we would try to engage a little bit with industry and government, and so I'll just quickly report what we did there. So we've been working with BT and NetScout in particularly through this follow-on funding. So it's EPSIC Impact Acceleration Project, which I was awarded a few months ago, that one of my postdocs, Dr. Junyi Ho, is taking up. And that's really actually looking at this problem of detecting very large-scale cyber attacks, so BGP hijacks. We've been working with the National Cybersecurity Center, particularly through the Alan Turing Institute. There's also this related funding coming in from LV, and they in particular fund a PhD studentship with COMPAS, which is the Institute of Statistical Science Center for doctoral training. And so we're supervising this PhD student, Ed Davis, with Dr. Dan Lawson. And here the application is networks relating to insurance fraud. Right? And this is again using some of the outputs of this Turing Fellowship. And finally, you can look at this blog post by Microsoft here. It's available online, and you can find out how Microsoft have been using our work, thanks to Annie Gray, who I acknowledged earlier, who was working with them over summer. And they're using our results for both anti-human trafficking and anti-corruption efforts. And if things go well, we're going to be working with them over the next few months to get our procedures into a demo, which is going to be presented at the UN Anti-Corruption Day in December. So that's only if things go very well. Okay, so these are the sort of academic outputs of this fellowship. 4 papers, I would say. The 4 papers obviously exist, but it's not always completely clear how, what percentage of my time they sort of correspond to. And the first paper was, well, it was my first ever single offer paper, and it was accepted in Europe's last year. And not only that, but it was selected for spotlight presentations, so top 5% of submissions. And then this year, this paper number 2 and 3, as announced last week, we had 2 papers accepted at NEURPS. So this is a PhD student, Annie Gray, who I'm co-supervising with Nick Whiteley, and then one of my PhD students, Ian Gallagher, and Andrew Jones here, who was on this fellowship, who was a postdoc with me on this fellowship until very recently. And finally, we have this 4th paper here, which is under revision as a journal paper, and that's where Andy has really sort of laid out the mathematical machinery that without which paper 3 would be completely impossible, and that's basically where the meat of the maths is to be found, if that's what you're interested in. And as I go through this talk, basically, I mean, I'll roughly cover these papers in order, basically. So papers 1 and 2 are about the analysis really of a single graph, whereas papers 3 and 4 are about extending these methods to analyzing multiple graphs. Okay, so this whole project starts with sort of empirical observation, which I made and many others have made, which is that when you use graph embedding, I'm using spectral embedding, which is just a way of doing graph embedding, and then you visualize the sorts of point clouds that you get. So typically you've got a high dimensional point cloud, so somehow to put it into a picture, a 2-dimensional plane, you need to use a tool, and here I'm using t-SNE. You tend to get these very rich structures, right? So picture A here is a computer network, picture B is another sort of computer network, and picture C is users rating restaurants in the USA. So that's pertinent, for example, to things like detecting fake reviews. The colors are independent information that kind of try to convince you that the geometric structure you're looking at isn't completely hallucinated. You get what I would say very rich and interesting pictures, and you can use t-SNE and you can use UMAP. You get different pictures, but you definitely get this sort of interesting structure. And you'd like to better understand basically what these embedding techniques can capture in terms of structure about the original network. And so the fundamental question really is, if you got this point cloud representation of this graph, and capital D here could be very large. Is there perhaps a reason to think that there could be hidden much lower dimensional structure? Right? And to use a mathematical term, I'll say manifold. So is there a reason to hope that somehow this point cloud, even though it's very high dimensional, it actually lies very close to a much lower dimensional curve or surface. So, I mean, this is the only sort of truly mathematical slide in the talk, and I'll just give you an intuitive explanation of what it says. What we're going to imagine as a statistical model is that somehow there is low-dimensional structure to be discovered in this graph in the first place, right? And to make that kind of concrete, what we assume is that for each node of a graph, or each entity on the network, there exists some low-dimensional vector representation of that node. And then somehow the links you observe are connected to those low-dimensional representations. And in particular, there's a function which can take two low-dimensional node representations and just return to you the probability that those two nodes would connect. Now this is all that this model is saying. Now, if that model holds, and then we apply graph embedding or spectral embedding specifically, might we hope that the structure we observe is somehow connected to the underlying vector representations of these nodes? And the content of the spotlight paper that I mentioned was to prove that that was the case. And basically, if in your model you have this very low dimensional representation of the nodes, and here little d here is just one, so the nodes are just represented on a line. When you apply graph embedding, what you'll get is a much higher dimensional point cloud than one, right? But what's secretly going to happen is that this line is just going to become a curve somehow hidden in a very high dimension. And then the point representation of each of the nodes, they're just going to be noisy observations that are sort of close to this curve. And of course, this curve, if little d was higher than one, would be a surface or something higher dimensional than that. But the point is, whatever it is, it's a structure that has a much lower dimension than the nominal dimension of the points that you're actually looking at, right? And so you can hope, therefore, to get great benefit in statistical inference, because generally in statistics, high dimension isn't your friend. So that was the first paper, and when Annie joined us with Nick, we had the obvious idea to try to do a little bit better than to say there is structure. Actually, what we wanted to do now is, well, how can we exploit this low-dimensional structure? And in the second paper, we made really the very sort of striking discovery, perhaps, that distance on this curve or on the surface is actually very closely related to the true distance between the entities that are hidden away from you in this graph. And this true distance is absolutely not the same as the ambient distance, that's to say the distance in this high dimensional point cloud. Right. So to give you a visualization, the distance between these 2 points is precisely the distance from here to here in this manifold. But for example, the distance between this point and this point is absolutely not this distance going straight through the manifold. You've got to follow the manifold to somehow get at this original true notion of distance. And you might say, well, why do I care about distance? Well, it turns out that if I know the distance between every entity in my network, I can actually recover their true physical positions, up to rotation, of course. So somehow, even though we never know this function f that's actually giving us the probability of a connection between two vectors, by trying to estimate this manifold and then the distance along this manifold, we're actually somehow able to recover the true positions of the original point. So that's kind of the amazing discovery, we think, that we were recently able to publish in Europe. Here's a little example. I mean, just kind of, so this is all by Annie, and it really just tells you how amazing things are. So the true points, right, it's a simulated example. The true points are just on a grid, they're really, really regular. But the function that takes 2 points and returns the probability that these 2 points should connect is a complicated thing. We picked it according to a few criteria, but basically, you know, you'd look at that thing, and there would be no a priori expectation that somehow you'd be able to recover the grid, right? And indeed, when you do spectral embedding, you get this point cloud over here in A. It's actually, if I remember correctly, a 5-dimensional point cloud. So we're only showing you 3 dimensions of it. And you see that the points are sort of spread and concentrating around this sort of structure that's lower than 3-dimensional, in fact, it's 2-dimensional. And it turns out that if you take 2 points in the structure and you compute their distance by following the structure, so following the manifold rather than going through it, then you will recover their true distance. And then from the true distances, you can recover the positions. And you can see basically as our graph gets large, so this is in C, slowly we recover the actual underlying grid, which could have seemed completely hidden from you. Oops, wrong way around. So here's an example on real data. Of course, the example in real data is a little bit less convincing. But still, I think you'll be convinced that it's a lot better than what you previously had available. Right? So what you're looking at here is a network corresponding to the global flight network. And to be sort of specific, what I mean is every node here is an airport, and there's going to be a link between 2 nodes if there has been a flight in that month between these 2 airports. Right? And we're looking at January 2020. So if you use spectral embedding, which is a type of graph embedding, then you'll get the picture on the left, and I mean, make of that what you will. I've highlighted a few sort of busy airports across the world. But if you use our technique and you try to uncover the hidden manifold structure, well, I'm not going to claim you get a perfect picture of the globe here, but certainly in the case of the US, which do recover true geographic features. So Los Angeles, for example, is on the opposite end of a continent to New York. Right, and although I haven't indicated in a picture, down at the bottom here, you have this cluster of airports, and they're just a bunch of airports in California. They're all about 200 kilometers away from each other, and Dallas and Chicago are again sort of not perfectly positioned, but at least in terms of longitude, just about right. Right, so certainly you'd claim that this is a more faithful representation of the US than we had over here in picture A. And in the paper, you can see the analysis that we did going from January to February to March, right into the pandemic, that we're able to use this techniques to say something about the change in the flight network when the pandemic hit us. So in the time I have left, I count that I have 2 minutes. I want to talk a little bit about the multiple network problem. Right? So this is a problem that happens in practice, right? Where rather than having a single graph, you have multiple graphs. And that could be for a number of reasons. I mean, the first one is you have a network, but the connections have different types. So in cybersecurity, for example, every connection you make has a port number, which indicates the sort of network behavior you're engaging in. So for example, port 80 would be web traffic, right? And port 25 would be email, right? So you can think that you have one network, or you can think that actually you've got multiple sort of overlaid networks, each corresponding to a port number. Or the other obvious application of this multiple network problem is when you're observing the network evolve over time, right? So people making connections over a year or a month or a minute. And what you can do is you can take these little windows of time and call those snapshots, and then suddenly you have a sequence of graphs, and you'd somehow like to do something with the sequence of networks. Right? Now, I'm not going to be able to describe the content of Andy's paper, which is 60 pages of maths in basically a minute. But broadly speaking, we've developed a new embedding technique, which we call unfolded spectral embedding, which allows us to answer many different sorts of inferential questions. So things about change detection, things about comparing graphs, things about matching graphs, things about predicting a link from one graph to another, and so on. And I'm only going to focus on a few highlights. So one thing that in many security applications we're interested in doing is somehow detecting changes in community structure over time. Okay, now, as a very sort of pedagogical and toy example, what we'll do is we'll just assume that we have 2 time steps, right? So we have time 1 and time 2. So we have a Monday and a Tuesday. We observe a graph on the Monday, we observe a graph on the Tuesday on the same nodes. And we assume that there are 4 communities, right? And in this narrative, the simulated example that I'm about to show you, what we'll have is we'll have the blue and the orange community, they're going to merge. So on Tuesday, basically, they just become the same community. The green community is going to somehow change its behavior, but independently of other communities. And finally, the red community is not going to change at all, this behavior. Right? And you somehow like to make that inference given the two graphs. So we simulate graphs over 2 time steps, following that, a specific statistical model that follows the generic narrative I just gave you. And we apply unfolded spectral embedding, so that's the left column, so that's the procedure we're proposing, a rival technique called omnibus embedding, and then the sort of obvious technique, which is independent embedding. Okay, and I'll just show you why our method is doing some good things. Right? So the first thing that you might remember is I said that the blue and the orange communities merge. And indeed you see in our picture that in the unfolded spectral embedding case that blue and orange are separate at time 1, but they're overlapping at time 2. So that's what we want to see. Over with independent spectral embedding, that's happening too. You've got blue over here and orange over here, but they merge at time 2. However, when you use omnibus embedding, that doesn't happen, right? When you're at time 2, for some reason, orange and blue don't merge. So we claim that's a disadvantage of omnibus embedding. And the other thing you might remember I said is that the red community doesn't change, right? And indeed, if you look at time 1 here, when you're doing unfolded spectral embedding, the red ellipse here is in identical position, and in fact has an identical shape over time 1 and time 2. That is true with omnibus embedding, but that isn't true with independent embedding. And you'll see that, although it's a little bit subtle, the red point cloud is not in the same position at time 1 and then time 2. So we prove basically that our method has these 2 sorts of stability. And in the remaining slide, I just want to show you what I think is basically the best ever real data example that I've ever had in any of my work. And this was found by Ian Gallagher, who's the first author of that paper. And tells you exactly what you need in a real data example for a stats methods paper. So the data set he found was basically interaction data between students at a high school. Right now, it's an experiment that was conducted many, many years ago. And this sort of experiment has become interesting again because of COVID again. As you know, and we only have the data for people who volunteered for the experiment, so there are no sort of ethical concerns. And what you have basically is you have a link between 2 students or a student and a teacher if they become in close proximity, close physical proximity, because they're all wearing bracelets basically that do this. So what you see when you use our method is you see what you want to see, right? You have this sort of persistent clustering over time, but then also at day 1, between 12 and 1, you see that all the students start to mingle, and it's because it's lunchtime, right? And the black dots here are the teachers, and they're keeping very far away from all the students. And you see the same here between 1 and 2, because again, it's still lunchtime. The students all get back together in class, and then you see the same thing on day 2 again, sort of mingling over lunchtime, right? I mean, the students are staying kind of far apart from the teachers staying far apart from the students. If you use independent spectral embedding, well, the point clouds aren't lined up, right? I mean, we would claim that this is nowhere near as useful as what we had, right? I mean, in practice, you wouldn't have the colors. The colors are, by the way, the classrooms that the students actually belong to. So, you know, a notion of true class or cluster. And if you use omnibus embedding, well, it's not bad, you know. I mean, it's a pretty good alternative, but we claim it kind of messes up the lunch times, right? So here you see this sort of phantom clustering between 1 to 2, which is coming from the lack of what we call cross-sectional stability of the omnibus method. So yeah, that's all I've prepared. So thank you very much for listening. And if there's a bit of time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I love that example. I've never seen that. That's fantastic. You kind of lose the teachers with the second. Okay, we've got the time for a couple of questions, I think. Can Can this be used for text analysis? Has any work been done? Any surprising close word embedding using this technique?
Okay, let me do that thing where I can actually reread the question to help process it.
Absolutely.
Stop the share. Go to that link.
You got it okay? Do you want me to give it to you again?
No, I got it. So can this be used for text analysis? Okay, so I don't know what part of the talk Anonymous was referring to, but if it's on the first part, which was about the analysis of a single graph, and then yes, actually, you can find several references out there who use manifold estimation on things like word2vec, right? It happens in text analysis, it happens in genetics, it happens across the sciences. People are using manifold estimation techniques to analyze graph embeddings and other sorts of embeddings. We claim and strongly believe we are the first to give a sort of rigorous, unified mathematical principle that actually explains why this manifold structure might occur and how you might sort of in a statistically consistent way try to exploit that manifold structure. So you can find references of it being used in practice successfully on things like text analysis, but I think we're the first to provide a good mathematical reason why it works.
Great, thanks. And the next one, specifically talking about slide 16, I can't remember which one that was.
Slide 16.
Have you considered removing the grid lines from the graphs to lower the data link ratio, must be, and
right.
make it easier to visualize?
So somehow make the picture nicer. If Annie's on the call, and I think Nick is, maybe we can take that feedback and try to improve our pictures, because we still have to submit the camera ready version of his paper. So if you didn't find the visualization to your taste, then maybe we can try to address that. Thank you for the feedback.
Great, and we're pretty much bang on time. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, first of all, to our three speakers, to Peter Flach, Song Liu, and Patrick Rubin Delanchy. Really fantastic insight into your work, and great to know that these Turing projects have been so successful and have gone on to support the work of other related colleagues as well in the terms of new fellowships and new publications. So really great all round. Can I also thank the organisers behind the scenes? So Lily Rice and Patty Holly, thank you for all your efforts putting these sessions together, and obviously for all our colleagues at the Alan Turing Institute that we work so closely together with. Thanks everybody, and if you enjoyed this, please come tomorrow, where the next session, same time, same place, will be on our Data Science for Science project. So see you then. Have a good morning. Bye.